Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are telling the story of three girls. Three girls who were born in the German-speaking lands of Europe in the middle of the 18th century. Three girls who were taken from their homes as teenagers and shipped to foreign countries to marry kings they had never met. Three girls who were given the same role, the same instructions, and the same expectations. Be beautiful, be quiet. Produce an air. Do as you are told. One of them did as she was told, and survived. Their names were Charlotte, Marie Antoinette, and Catherine. They never met. They never corresponded. But their lives ran in parallel, shaped by the same system, tested by the same pressures, and defined by the choices they made when the system broke down and the rules stopped working. And the death of one of them sent a shockwave through the palaces of Europe that changed the way every monarchy behaved for the next 100 years. This is the story of three queens and three fates. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to drift into sleep or to follow the intertwined fates of three remarkable women, I am glad you are with me. And if you have not yet subscribed, I would love it if you did, so that you never miss a story. Now, let us meet the three girls. The system that produced all three of them was old, efficient, and completely indifferent to the wishes of the women it consumed. It worked like this. The royal families of Europe needed to marry their children to other royal families. The marriages served political purposes, cementing alliances, ending wars, securing borders, producing heirs who would carry forward the family's claim to the throne. The sons were important because they would rule. The daughters were important because they could be traded. A princess was, in the calculations of 18th century diplomacy, a commodity. Her value was measured in the alliances she could bring, the heirs she could produce, and the political advantage her family could extract from her marriage. Her own wishes were irrelevant. Her happiness was a bonus, not a goal. She was trained from childhood for a role she had not chosen, a role that required her to leave her country, learn a new language, adopt a new religion, produce children on demand, and submit to a husband she had never met, all while maintaining a composure and a grace that concealed whatever she actually felt about the arrangement. Germany was the factory that produced queens for the rest of Europe. The German-speaking lands were divided into hundreds of small states, duchies, and principalities, each one ruled by a family that was technically royal, but that often had no more money or power than a prosperous English squire. These families had one asset that the great powers valued. They had daughters, Protestant daughters, raised in modest courts, educated in the appropriate accomplishments, and available for export. The great powers, England and France and Russia and Prussia and Austria, sent their agents to these small German courts the way modern corporations send recruiters to universities, looking for talent, assessing candidates, making offers that could not be refused. Charlotte, Marie Antoinette, and Catherine were all products of this system. Charlotte was the product of the smallest factory, a duchy so obscure that George III's advisors had to look it up on a map. Marie Antoinette was the product of the grandest factory, the Habsburg court, where the production of marriageable princesses was a state enterprise. Catherine was the product of a factory so small and so poor that her mother had to campaign aggressively to get her daughter noticed. Three different starting points, three different scales of ambition, one identical destination. A foreign throne, a foreign husband, a foreign life. Charlotte was born in 1744 in the Palace of Miro, a small castle on a lake in the Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, in what is now northern Germany. The duchy was tiny, barely a speck on the map of Europe, so insignificant that most diplomats could not have pointed to it without consulting an atlas. The palace was modest, surrounded by woods and water, a place of quiet beauty and no political importance whatsoever. Her father, Duke Charles, died when Charlotte was 8. Her mother, Princess Elizabeth Albertine, raised the children alone on a limited income in a household that was comfortable but not grand. Charlotte was the youngest daughter. She was educated in the manner considered appropriate for a minor German princess. which meant she learned French, Italian, some Latin, music, botany, and needlework. She was described by those who knew her as sweet-tempered, sensible, and plain. Not beautiful, not brilliant, but agreeable, which in the marriage market of the 18th century was often more valuable than either beauty or brilliance. She had no expectation of a great marriage. The daughters of tiny German duchies did not marry kings. They married minor princes, if they were lucky, and settled into quiet lives in quiet courts. Charlotte expected this. Her mother expected this. Everyone expected this. And then in 1761 a letter arrived. George III, the young King of England, was looking for a wife. His requirements were specific. He wanted a Protestant princess who was good-tempered and unlikely to meddle in politics. He wanted someone who would do as she was told without causing trouble. Charlotte fit perfectly. She was Protestant. She was royal technically, though the royalty was so minor as to be invisible. She had no political connections, no powerful family, no agenda. She was nobody, and nobody was exactly what George wanted. Charlotte's mother said goodbye to her at the gates of Miro and never saw her again. Elizabeth Albertine was a practical woman who understood that her daughter's marriage to the King of England was the greatest thing that had ever happened to the family, and that sentiment could not be allowed to interfere with opportunity. She helped Charlotte pack. She gave her advice about managing a household, about being patient with a new husband, about remembering her prayers. She did not cry at the gate, or if she did, Charlotte did not mention it in the letters she wrote home. Letters that arrived in Mecklensacht Strelitz weeks after they were sent, and that Elizabeth read in the same small room where she had raised her daughter, holding the paper to the light from the window, tracing the handwriting that was becoming solemn with each letter, slightly more English and slightly less German. Elizabeth died in 1761. The same year Charlotte married. She lived long enough to know that her youngest daughter was Queen of England. She did not live long enough to meet her grandchildren, or to see Charlotte settle into the role, or to know that the marriage she had arranged so hastily and so hopefully would turn out to be one of the happiest royal marriages in European history. The goodbye at the gate was the last time mother and daughter saw each other, and the finality of it, which both of them must have suspected but neither acknowledge, the parting a weight that is difficult to carry across 2.5 centuries. Alice mourned that she was going to marry the King of England. She had never met him. She had never been to England. She had a few weeks to prepare before leaving home forever. She was 17 years old. Marie Antoinette was born in 1755 in the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, the imperial seat of the Habsburg dynasty, the most powerful family in Europe. Her world could not have been more different from Charlotte's. Where Charlotte grew up in a small castle on a lake, Marie Antoinette grew up in a palace complex that covered acres, staffed by thousands, filled with art and music, and the constant hum of political intrigue. Her mother, Maria Theresa, was Empress of Austria and one of the most formidable women in European history. She ruled an empire, fought wars, reformed governments, and raised 16 children, using every single one of them as a political instrument. Each child was a chess piece. Sons were married to princesses who brought alliances. Daughters were married to kings who could be converted from enemies into friends. Maria Theresa loved her children in her way, but she loved her empire more, and the children existed to serve it. Maria Theresa's letters to her daughter are among the most extraordinary documents of the 18th century. They are long, detailed, demanding, and suffused with a love that expresses itself almost entirely through criticism. Maria Theresa wrote to Marie Antoinette constantly, sometimes weekly, and the letters read like dispatches from a general who can see the battlefield from a distance and who watches, with mounting horror, as the officer in charge makes every possible mistake. She criticized Marie Antoinette's spending. She criticized her late nights. She criticized her choice of friends. She criticized her failure to produce an heir. She criticized her hair, her clothes, her posture, her handwriting. The criticism was relentless and it was motivated by love, which made it worse. because criticism from someone who does not care can be dismissed, but criticism from someone who loves you penetrates deeper and stays longer. The letters also reveal Maria Theresa's growing awareness that her daughter was in danger. As the 1780s progressed and the French economy deteriorated, Maria Theresa's letters became less about hairstyles and more about politics. She urged Marie Antoinette to cultivate allies. She urged her to moderate her spending. She urged her to pay attention to the mood of the country, to the hunger in the streets, to the pamphlets that were being published about her. Marie Antoinette read the letters. She sometimes cried after reading them. She rarely followed the advice because following the advice would have required her to become a different person, and becoming a different person was not something she knew how to do. Maria Theresa died in 1780, 9 years before the Revolution. She never knew what happened to her daughter. She never knew about the mob at Versailles, the imprisonment, the trial, the scaffold. She died believing that Marie Antoinette was safe, that the marriage she had arranged was holding, that the alliance she had built would endure. The mercy of her death was that it spared her the knowledge of her daughter's fate, knowledge that would have destroyed her more completely than any political defeat. Marie Antoinette mourned her mother deeply. She wore black for months. She cancelled her social engagements. She retreated to the Trianon and spent days alone, reading her mother's letters, crying, regretting the arguments and the resistance and the failure to listen that had characterized their relationship. The loss was complicated by guilt, the guilt of a daughter who knows she disappointed her mother and who will never have the chance to make it right. Maria Theresa had been demanding and critical and impossible to please. She had also been the only person in the world who was trying to save Marie Antoinette. And Marie Antoinette understood this too late, after the saving was no longer possible. Marie Antoinette was the 15th of 16 children. She was not her mother's favorite. She was, by Maria Theresa's own assessment, the least impressive of her daughters. Her tutors reported that she could barely write a coherent sentence in any language, including her native German. She could not sit still long enough to read a book. Her handwriting was atrocious. Her attention span was non-existent. Her charm was considerable. Her intellect was not, but charm was enough for France. Maria Theresa matched her with the Dauphin, the heir to the French throne, because the match cemented an alliance between Austria and France, two countries that had been enemies for centuries. Marie Antoinette was the price of the alliance. She was 14 years old. Her mother spent 2 years trying to prepare her. The improvement was modest. Marie Antoinette learned enough French to get by and enough etiquette to survive. What she did not learn was how to survive in a court more dangerous than any battlefield. The handover at the French border in May 1770 was one of the most elaborate and most cruel rituals in diplomatic history. Marie Antoinette was escorted to a pavilion on an island in the Rhine. Inside, she was stripped of everything Austrian. Her clothes were removed. Her attendants were dismissed. Her little pug dog, which she had brought from Vienna, was taken from her. She was redressed in French clothes, introduced to French attendants, and led out as a new person. The Austrian girl was symbolically erased. She was 14. She cried for her dog. Catherine was born in 1729, the oldest of the three, in the city of Stettin in Pomerania. Her father, Prince Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst, was the military governor of the city, a minor appointment that reflected the family's minor status. They were poor by royal standards, living in quarters provided by the Prussian crown dependent on her father's salary. Catherine's relationship with her mother was the most complicated of the three. Johanna Elizabeth was not a warm woman. She was ambitious, calculating, and transparently self-interested, and she saw her daughter not as a person to be loved but as an instrument to be used. When the Russian match materialized, Johanna threw herself into the project with an energy that was impressive and an indiscretion that was catastrophic. Johanna accompanied Catherine to Russia and immediately began meddling in Russian politics, forming alliances with factions at court, passing information to Frederick the Great of Prussia, and generally behaving as though the Russian court were a playground for her personal ambitions. Empress Elizabeth was not amused. She expelled Johanna from Russia within months of Catherine's marriage, sending her home in disgrace and leaving Catherine alone in a foreign court without the one person who, for all her faults, was at least family. The expulsion was humiliating for Catherine, but also, in a way she did not immediately recognize, liberating. Without her mother's presence, Catherine was free to become herself rather than the person her mother wanted her to be. She was free to make her own alliances, her own decisions, her own mistakes. She was free to become Russian without Johanna standing behind her whispering German. Catherine never saw her mother again. Johanna died in Paris in 1760, impoverished and forgotten, the ambition that had consumed her life, having produced nothing of lasting value except the daughter she had pushed so hard and understood so little. Catherine received the news of her mother's death with a composure that the court interpreted as coldness, but that was probably something more complicated: the grief of a daughter who had never been loved in the way she needed to be, and who had long ago stopped expecting it. The three mothers form a pattern that mirrors the three queens themselves. Elizabeth Albertine, Charlotte's mother, was modest, practical, and kind, and she produced a queen who was modest, practical, and enduring. Maria Theresa was brilliant, demanding, and strategic, and she produced a daughter who was charming, reckless, and ultimately overwhelmed. Johanna Elizabeth was ambitious, calculating, and cold, and she produced a daughter who was ambitious, calculating, and unstoppable. The mothers did not determine the daughters' fates, but they shaped the raw material from which those fates were built. Her mother, Princess Johanna Elizabeth, was ambitious in a way that her husband was not. Johanna was connected by blood to several more prominent royal families, and she resented the modesty of her position. She saw in her daughter Sophie, as Catherine was then known, an opportunity. Sophie was different from the other two girls from childhood. She was sharp. She paid attention to everything and forgot nothing. She read voraciously, novels and history and philosophy, with an appetite that her mother found unfeminine and her tutors found remarkable. She asked questions that adults could not answer. She formed opinions that adults did not expect. She was, at 12, already recognizably the woman she would become: watchful, calculating, brilliant, and completely unwilling to accept the limitations that her birth had imposed on her. The Russian match came through a combination of family connections and Prussian diplomacy. Empress Elizabeth of Russia needed a bride for her nephew Peter, the heir to the throne. She wanted someone young, healthy, Protestant, and from a family too weak to be dangerous. Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst met every requirement. Sophie's mother pushed the match with an aggression that embarrassed everyone except herself. Sophie arrived in Russia at 15 and understood immediately that her survival depended on becoming Russian. She learned the language with a ferocity that astonished the court. She studied orthodoxy with genuine dedication. She got up in the middle of the night to pace the cold stone floors studying Russian vocabulary, and she caught pneumonia so severe she nearly died. When the court physicians asked if she wanted a Lutheran pastor, she asked for an Orthodox priest. The gesture was political genius. It was also sincere. She was becoming Catherine before anyone gave her the name. The husbands determined everything. Charlotte met George III on the day of their wedding, September 8, 1761. She arrived in England seasick and exhausted, her dress so heavy with silver embroidery that it nearly fell off her thin frame. She walked into St. James's Palace and saw for the first time the man she would spend the rest of her life with. George was 23. He was tall, slim, fair-haired, and so nervous that he could barely speak. He was also kind. This would turn out to be the most important thing about him. The kindness was not a performance. George was genuinely constitutionally kind, a man who preferred a quiet evening at home to a grand ball, who read books for pleasure and played music for relaxation, who wanted a companion rather than a trophy. Charlotte was not beautiful. George did not mind. She was intelligent, sensible, and warm, and within weeks of the wedding they had developed an affection that would deepen into love over the decades that followed. Charlotte's journey to England was the most disorienting experience of her young life. She left Mecklenburg-Strelitz in August 1761, accompanied by a small retinue that would be dismissed the moment she reached English soil. She traveled by carriage across northern Germany to the coast, then crossed the North Sea in a yacht that the English had sent for her. The crossing was rough. Charlotte was violently seasick, so ill that she could barely stand when the yacht finally reached the English coast. She arrived at Harwich looking, by her own later admission, dreadful, her hair disordered, her complexion green, her beautiful wedding dress crumpled from the journey. She had spent the crossing trying to learn English. She spoke French fluently, which was the language of the European courts, but English was strange to her, full of sounds that German did not have and rules that French did not follow. She had practiced phrases with her ladies, rehearsing the words she would say to the king, the greetings and the courtesies that protocol required. She wanted to get it right. She wanted to make a good impression. She was 17 years old and she was about to meet the man she would spend the rest of her life with. And she had no idea what he looked like, what he sounded like, whether he was kind or cruel, whether he would find her attractive or disappointing. The meeting happened at St. James's Palace on the evening of September 8. Charlotte was escorted into the king's presence, still pale from the crossing, still thin from the seasickness, wearing the heavy silver dress that was supposed to impress, but that hung awkwardly on her diminished frame. She knelt. George raised her up. They looked at each other for the first time. George was not what she expected, though she had been careful not to expect too much. He was tall and fair and young and serious, with an expression of earnest concentration that softened when he smiled. He was nervous, visibly nervous, his hands fidgeting with his cuffs, his eyes darting from Charlotte to the courtiers and back again. The nervousness endeared him to her immediately because it told her that he cared, that the impression she made on him mattered, that this was not a formality to him but a genuine human encounter. They were married that evening. They had known each other for approximately 3 hours. Their marriage was, by royal standards, extraordinary. They actually liked each other. They ate breakfast together every morning. They played music together in the evenings. They discussed the children, the household, the garden. George consulted Charlotte on matters that other kings would not have discussed with their wives, not political matters but domestic and family decisions that he valued her opinion on. The marriage was a partnership, not a performance, and the partnership sustained both of them through the crises that were coming. Louis was not the villain of Marie Antoinette's story, though it is tempting to cast him as one. He was a decent man trapped in a role he was not suited for. He was intelligent, well-read, and genuinely concerned about the welfare of his people, qualities that in a private citizen would have made him an admirable man, and that in a king made him a tragic one, because the qualities he possessed were not the qualities that France needed in a crisis. He was physically awkward, large and clumsy, with a tendency to sweat that the courtiers found distasteful. He was socially uncomfortable, preferring the solitude of his workshop, where he made locks and keys with a craftsman's precision, to the performance of court life. Mademoiselle clung to Marie Antoinette in a vague, distracted way, giving her gifts and permissions that a more attentive husband would have withheld, not because he was generous but because he was inattentive. He said yes to her spending because saying no required a confrontation, and confrontation was the thing Louis feared most in the world. His inability to say no extended to politics, where it was fatal. He could not say no to the court, which demanded extravagance. He could not say no to the ministers who gave contradictory advice. He could not say no to the people who demanded reform. And he could not say no to the revolution, which demanded his crown and then his life. At every turning point, Louis hesitated, compromised, delayed, hoping that the crisis would resolve itself, hoping that someone else would make the difficult decision, hoping that the world would return to normal without requiring him to act. The world did not return to normal, and Louis' inability to act was the void into which the revolution poured. Marie Antoinette met Louis on the road to Versailles. shortly after the handover ceremony. He was 15. He was awkward, overweight, and painfully shy. Behilzen. He was obsessed with hunting and with locksmithing, a hobby that involved him spending hours in a workshop, making locks and keys while his young wife waited in her apartments for attention that did not come. He was not unkind. He was simply absent, physically present but emotionally unreachable. A man who seemed to exist behind a pane of glass that no amount of charm could penetrate. The marriage was not consummated for 7 years. 7 years. The failure was public because at Versailles everything was public and the humiliation was constant. The court whispered. The diplomats reported back to Vienna. Maria Theresa wrote anguished letters demanding to know why there was no heir. Pamphlets circulated in Paris mocking the king's impotence and the queen's frustration. Marie Antoinette endured the humiliation with a dignity that cracked only in her private letters to her mother, letters that reveal a young woman who was lonely, bewildered, and increasingly desperate. The 7 years of unconsummated marriage were a torment that shaped everything Marie Antoinette became. The entire court knew, the ambassadors reported home. Maria Theresa wrote letter after letter, increasingly desperate, demanding to know what was happening, offering advice, sending doctors, suggesting remedies. The letters are painful to read. A mother watching from a distance as her daughter fails at the one task that matters, unable to help, unable to understand, reduced to writing instructions about matters so intimate that even a mother should not have to discuss them in correspondence. Marie Antoinette's response to the humiliation was to seek distraction. She could not control what happened in her bedroom, but she could control what happened outside it. She threw herself into the social life of Versailles with an energy that was partly genuine enthusiasm and partly desperation. She attended every ball, every opera, every party. She stayed out until dawn. She gambled. She surrounded herself with a circle of friends who were young, attractive, and unserious, people who would laugh with her and dance with her and help her forget, for an evening, the emptiness that waited for her at the end of every night. The spending began as therapy and became a habit. A new dress lifted her mood. A new pair of shoes provided a moment of pleasure. A redecorated room gave her a sense of control over a life that was otherwise controlled entirely by others. The spending was excessive by any standard, but it was also comprehensible. The response of a woman who had no power except the power to buy things, and who exercised that power with the enthusiasm of someone who had nothing else. The court judged her harshly. The French aristocracy, which had its own elaborate system of infidelities and hypocrisies, decided that Marie Antoinette was frivolous, which she was, and irresponsible, which she sometimes was, and unworthy of the crown, which was a judgment that would prove fatal. The judgment hardened over the years and eventually seeped out of the court and into the public consciousness, where it was amplified by the press and the pamphleteers into a caricature of greed and decadence that bore only a partial resemblance to the real woman. The real woman was more complicated than the caricature. She was generous, sometimes to a fault. She adopted several children from poor families and paid for their education. She visited hospitals and orphanages and was genuinely moved by what she saw. Introndispeculate, she was warm with her servants, informal in a way that the protocol of Versailles did not encourage, and the servants who knew her personally often defended her against the charges that the public leveled against her. She was not the monster that the revolution painted. She was a young woman who had been placed in an impossible situation and who had responded imperfectly, as most people do. When the marriage was finally consummated, probably after Louis underwent a minor medical procedure, Marie Antoinette wrote to her mother with a joy that is painful to read. The relief was enormous. She had been living under a pressure that no modern person can fully appreciate. The pressure to produce an heir that the entire country was watching for, that diplomats in every capital in Europe were waiting for, that her mother's letters demanded in every post. The pressure had lasted 7 years, and it had changed her, had pushed her toward the spending and the socializing, and the frantic pursuit of pleasure that the public would eventually hold against her. Catherine married Peter in August 1745, and the marriage was a disaster from the wedding night. Peter was 17, immature in a way that went beyond his years, obsessed with toy soldiers and military drill, possibly unable to consummate the marriage, certainly unwilling to try. He played with dolls. He set up miniature battlefields in his apartments and reenacted famous battles while Catherine lay in the next room. Ignored, Peter was not merely a bad husband, he was a peculiar one. He had been raised in Holstein, a German duchy, and he identified as German rather than Russian, a fact that he announced openly, and that the Russian court found both insulting and alarming. He admired Frederick the Great of Prussia, with a devotion that bordered on worship, collecting Prussian military uniforms, drilling his servants in Prussian-style formations and expressing his preference for Prussia over Russia so loudly and so frequently that the Russian nobles who would eventually help Catherine overthrow him began planning years before the coup actually happened. In the bedroom that they shared in the early months of their marriage, Peter set up a puppet theater and put on shows for Catherine instead of consummating the marriage. He brought his collection of toy soldiers to bed. He drilled them on the bedspread, moving the miniature figures through formations while Catherine lay beside him, watching, saying nothing, understanding with a clarity that was beyond her years that this man was not going to be the partner she needed, and that if she wanted a future she would have to build it herself. Catherine's loneliness in the early years of her marriage was profound. She was young, she was in a foreign country. Her husband ignored her, and the Empress Elizabeth, who had arranged the marriage, treated her with a suspicion that intensified when the expected heir failed to appear. Catherine filled the loneliness with reading. She read for hours every day, working through the great works of European philosophy and history with the systematic thoroughness that would later characterize her approach to governance. The reading was not an escape from her situation. It was preparation for a situation she could not yet see but that she was already unconsciously preparing for it soon. She wrote in her memoirs that the years of her marriage to Peter were the most difficult of her life, worse than the years of political crisis that followed, because at least during the crisis she had power and agency and the ability to act. She was a minor figure in a hostile court, married to a man who despised her, watched by an empress who mistrusted her, surrounded by courtiers who were waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing their loyalty. She survived by being patient, by being observant, and by being smarter than everyone around her, qualities that her enemies recognized too late and that her allies never fully appreciated. Catherine responded to her husband's neglect in the most Catherine way possible. She educated herself. She read Voltaire, she read Montesquieu, she read Tacitus and Plutarch and the histories of every great empire that had ever existed. She studied the Russian court, the way a general studies a battlefield, learning the alliances, the rivalries, the weaknesses, the pressure points. She made friends strategically. She cultivated allies among the Guards regiments, the military officers who would, when the time came, provide the muscle she needed. She also took lovers. This was not unusual at the Russian court, where the line between public duty and private life was blurred to the point of non-existence. Her first serious lover was Sergei Saltykov, a young officer who was probably the father of her son Paul. Her second was Stanislaw Poniatowski, a Polish diplomat whom she would later make King of Poland. Her third was Grigory Orlov, a Guards officer whose brothers commanded the regiments that would eventually put her on the throne. Each relationship served a purpose. Each relationship was also, to varying degrees, genuine. Catherine was capable of love. Peter knew about the lovers. He did not care. He had his own mistress, Elizabeth Vorontsova, whom he preferred to Catherine in every way, and whom he made no effort to conceal. The court watched the disintegrating marriage with the detached fascination of people watching a building collapse in slow motion. Everyone knew it was going to end badly. The only question was what form the ending would take. The Telluses they lived in shaped them as profoundly as the husbands they married, Charlotte's Buckingham House was modest by continental standards. George disliked extravagance. The household rose early. Breakfast was simple. The evenings were quiet. Charlotte loved botany with a scholar's seriousness, helping develop the gardens at Kew, introducing exotic species from across the empire, corresponding with naturalists who sent specimens from Africa. The Strelitzia, the bird of paradise flower, was named after her. She also loved snuff, taking it in quantities that earned her the nickname Snuffy Charlotte, a term the public used with affection rather than mockery. Marie Antoinette's Versailles was a beautiful prison. She was watched from the moment she woke. Her morning dressing was a public ceremony where ladies competed for the honor of handing her garments. She once stood naked and shivering while her chemise was passed from hand to hand across the room, each transfer a demonstration of rank that took priority over the Queen's comfort. She ate in public, the food cold by the time it reached her, because the kitchen was a 15-minute walk from the dining room. Her escape was the Petit Trianon, a small house in the grounds where she could dress as she pleased and see only friends she chose. She built a model village with pretty cottages and groomed animals where she played at being a shepherdess. It has been mocked for centuries as the ultimate symbol of aristocratic cluelessness. It was also the desperate act of a woman who wanted, just for an afternoon. Marie Antoinette's daily routine at Versailles was a performance that began the moment she opened her eyes. The first woman to enter her bedroom in the morning had the honor of pulling back the bed curtains, a task that was assigned by rank and that could not be delegated. The Queen then lay in bed while her ladies assembled, each one entering in order of precedence, each one curtsying, each one taking up her assigned position for the liver. The dressing took an hour. The chemise was followed by the corset, which was laced so tightly that breathing became an exercise in discipline. The petticoats came next, layers of silk and satin that added volume and weight until the Queen could barely walk without assistance. The gown was put on last, an elaborate construction of fabric and embroidery that might weigh 20 pounds, and that took two ladies working together to fasten. The hair was dressed by a specialist, the famous Leonard, who built towering confections of powdered hair and decorations that could include feathers, flowers, ribbons, model ships, and on one memorable occasion a pastoral scene with miniature shepherds. Marie Antoinette submitted to this process every day, and she hated it. She hated the publicity. She hated the layers of clothing. She hated the uncomfortable chairs and the stiff formality, and the constant awareness that every gesture she made was being observed, catalogued, and judged. At the Petit Trianon, she wore muslin dresses and straw hats and let her hair hang loose, and the relief of simplicity was so overwhelming that she spent more and more time there, which the court interpreted as a snub and the public interpreted as proof that she was hiding something. Marie Antoinette's personality has been distorted by 2 centuries of propaganda, first revolutionary and then royalist, until the real woman has almost disappeared behind the myths. The revolutionary myth painted her as a monster of greed. The Walpurgis myth painted her as a saint of martyrdom. Neither is accurate. She was a human being, more complicated than either myth allows. She was warm. She was the kind of person who lit up a room when she entered it, who made people feel welcome and important and liked. Her charm was not calculated. It was natural, an overflow of a personality that was fundamentally sociable, and that found its energy in the company of other people. She remembered names. She asked about children. She inquired about illnesses. She made the people around her feel seen, which is a gift that has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with empathy. She was funny. Her humor was physical rather than verbal, expressed in imitations and gestures rather than in witty remarks. She mocked the solemnity of court ceremonial with a skill that delighted her friends and horrified the older courtiers. She once imitated the archbishop's sermon so accurately that her ladies-in-waiting could not breathe for laughing. The imitation was not malicious. It was the humor of a young woman who found the world she lived in absurd, and who expressed the absurdity in the only way available to her, through laughter. She loved the theatre. She performed in private theatricals at the Trianon, playing shepherdesses and milkmaids with an enthusiasm that revealed both her talent and her longing. She was a decent actress by amateur standards, and the joy she found on stage was the joy of being someone else, of escaping for an evening the relentless scrutiny that was the defining feature of her life at Versailles. On stage she could be anyone. Off stage, she could only be the queen, and the queen was a role that did not suit her. She was generous to a fault. She gave money to people who asked for it, sometimes large amounts, without inquiring too closely into whether the need was genuine. She sponsored the education of poor children. She paid the debts of servants who had fallen on hard times. Her personal charity was real, and it was substantial. But it was invisible to a public that saw only the dresses and the diamonds and that did not know, because the court did not publicize such things, that the queen who spent a fortune on shoes also orphans. Her great weakness was her inability to think strategically. She lived in the moment. She responded to the person in front of her, rather than to the political situation around her. She made friends with people who amused her, rather than people who could help her. She made enemies of people who bored her rather than people who threatened her. She could not see around corners. She could not anticipate consequences. She could not understand, until it was far too late, that the world she lived in was changing in ways that would consume her if she did not change with it. The spending on fashion was enormous, though it was partly the result of a system that required a Queen of France to appear in a new outfit for every public occasion. She could not wear the same dress twice. She could not appear in anything that was less than perfect. The standard was set not by Marie Antoinette but by Versailles itself, and the standard was ruinous. Her dress bills ran to hundreds of thousands of livres per year, sums that were reported in the press with an outrage that was both genuine and hypocritical, because the system that demanded the spending was the same system that condemned the spender. Her gambling losses were another source of public anger. Marie Antoinette gambled because everyone at Versailles gambled. It was the primary evening entertainment, the alternative to boredom in a court where the days were long and the diversions were limited. She played faro, a card game in which the stakes could be high and the losses rapid, and she played with a recklessness that reflected both her personality and her desperation. She was bored, she was lonely. She was trapped in a life that offered no privacy, no freedom, and no genuine human connection except her children. The gambling was an escape, and like most escapes, it came at a cost. Her spending was legendary. She spent fortunes on dresses, on gambling, on jewels, on parties, on the renovations of her private apartments. Some of the spending was genuine extravagance. Some was the standard expenditure of a French queen that was magnified by a hostile press into something monstrous. The diamond necklace affair, a scandal in which Marie Antoinette was falsely accused of secretly purchasing an enormously expensive diamond necklace, damaged her reputation beyond repair, even though she was innocent. The public believed the worst about her because they wanted to believe the worst, and the wanting was more powerful than the truth. Catherine's winter palace in Saint Petersburg was enormous, cold, and dangerous. The corridors were full of conspiracies. The court was a place where careers were made and ended in a single evening, where a whispered word to the wrong person could mean exile to Siberia, where the line between favor and disgrace was invisible and could be crossed without knowing you had crossed it. Catherine thrived in this environment, the way some plants thrive in poor soil, putting down roots that went deeper because the surface was hostile. Catherine's achievements as empress were staggering in their scope. She inherited a country that was medieval in many respects, governed by laws that were contradictory and cruel, administered by a bureaucracy that was corrupt and incompetent, and defended by an army that was large but poorly organized. She set about reforming every aspect of Russian life with an energy that left her ministers exhausted and her foreign admirers astonished. She commissioned a new legal code, the nakaz, based on Enlightenment principles. She wrote much of it herself, drawing on the works of Montesquieu and Beccaria, producing a document that advocated religious tolerance, opposed torture, and argued for the equality of all subjects before the law. The nakaz was radical by Russian standards and moderately progressive by European standards, and its publication in 1767 established Catherine's reputation as an enlightened monarch, a reputation she cultivated with the same skill she brought to everything else. She founded schools, including the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, the first state-funded institution for the education of women in Europe. She established hospitals and orphanages. She promoted vaccination, submitting to inoculation against smallpox herself, and then publicizing the fact, using her own body as an argument for modern medicine in a country where most people regarded vaccination with superstitious terror. She expanded the empire relentlessly. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 gave Russia access to the warm water ports of the Black Sea, a strategic objective that Russian rulers had pursued for centuries. The partitions of Poland, conducted in collaboration with Prussia and Austria, erased Poland from the map of Europe entirely and added millions of new subjects to the Russian Empire. The expansion was ruthless, unprincipled, and spectacularly effective. Catherine did not apologize for it. Empresses do not apologize. Her court at Saint Petersburg became the most intellectually vibrant in Europe. She invited scholars, artists, and writers from across the continent, offering them patronage, housing, and the stimulation of her own conversation. Diderot spent 5 months as her guest, visiting her every afternoon for conversations that ranged across philosophy, politics, art, and the nature of power. He later wrote that talking to Catherine was like talking to the most brilliant man in Europe, except that she was more practical and more amusing. The art collection she assembled was one of the greatest in the world. She bought paintings by the hundred, sometimes purchasing entire collections at once, filling the Winter Palace with masterworks that would eventually form the core of the Hermitage Museum. She bought Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son. She bought Raphael's Madonna. She bought works by Rubens, Van Dyck, Titian, and Poussin. The purchasing was partly aesthetic and partly political, a demonstration that Russia was not the backward, barbaric country that Western Europe assumed it to be. Every painting on the walls of the Winter Palace was an argument that Russia belonged among the great civilizations, and Catherine made the argument with her checkbook. She collected art on a scale that was staggering even by royal standards. She bought entire collections, thousands of paintings at a time, filling the Winter Palace with masterworks by Rembrandt, Rubens, Van Dyck, and every other great artist of the European tradition. Her collection became the Hermitage Museum, one of the greatest art museums in the world. She collected art the way other people collect stamps, compulsively, competitively, with an appetite that was part aesthetic and part political, because a palace full of masterworks was a statement of power that every visiting diplomat could understand. Catherine's personality was as complex as her politics. She was charming in person, warm, funny, genuinely interested in the people she spoke with. Visitors to her court were routinely surprised by how approachable she was, how willing to laugh, how capable of putting a nervous diplomat at ease with a joke or a personal question. The charm was real. It was also a tool. Catherine understood that a smile from an empress was worth more than a threat from a minister, and she deployed her charm with the same strategic precision she brought to everything else. She was vain about her writing. She composed plays, operas, fairy tales, and historical essays, and she expected her courtiers to praise them with an enthusiasm that was not always justified by the quality. The plays were competent but not brilliant. The essays were intelligent but not original. The fairy tales were charming but forgettable. Catherine's talent was for governance, not for literature, and the gap between her ambition as a writer and her achievement was a gap that no one at court dared to mention. She was physically active well into her 60s. She walked every day, regardless of the St. Petersburg weather, which could be brutal. She rode horses until her body would no longer allow it. She swam. She played billiards. She had an energy that exhausted people half her age and that she attributed to her routine: the early rising, the strong coffee, the daily walk, the habit of keeping her mind and her body in constant motion. She had a horror of boredom. Boredom was, for Catherine, the worst possible condition. Worse than danger, worse than conflict, worse than the constant threat of conspiracy that accompanied her reign. She filled every moment of every day with activity, with work, with conversation, with reading, with the relentless acquisition of art and ideas and information that characterized her entire life. A minister who arrived for an audience and found the empress idle would have been as shocked as a sailor who arrived at port and found the ocean dry. It simply did not happen. She also wrote plays, corresponded with Voltaire and Diderot, reformed Russian law, founded schools, established hospitals, and governed with a hands-on attention to detail that exhausted her ministers and impressed foreign observers. She was the most intelligent of the three queens by a considerable margin, and her intelligence was not abstract or theoretical. It was practical, strategic, and deployed with a ruthlessness that her charm could not entirely conceal. Motherhood tested all three of them, and the tests were very different. The fate of Charlotte's daughters deserves more attention, because it reveals the limits of Charlotte's power and the cruelty of the system she lived within. Charlotte wanted her daughters to marry. She identified suitable matches. She argued with George. She deployed every weapon in her domestic arsenal: persuasion, persistence, the quiet pressure of a wife who has learned, over decades, how to move a stubborn husband in the direction she wants him to go. It was not enough. George would not yield. His love for his daughters had curdled into possessiveness, and the possessiveness was reinforced by his illness, which made him anxious about any change and especially anxious about the departure of people he loved. Princess Augusta was the first to accept her fate. She was the practical one, the daughter who understood that arguing with her father was pointless and who channeled her energy into useful activities within the palace. She managed her mother's affairs. She organized charitable events. She became the family's administrator, the person who kept track of birthdays and correspondence, and the endless small details that a large family generates. She was capable and she was wasted, a woman who could have managed an estate or run a household with distinction, but who was instead confined to managing her mother's diary. Princess Elizabeth was the artistic one. She painted, she drew, she designed furniture and interiors with a skill that would have earned her a living if she had been born into a different class. She decorated rooms at the palace that still bear her mark. She published books of engravings. She filled the empty hours with creative work that was both an expression of her talent and a protest against her confinement, though the protest was never articulated and the talent was never fully used. Princess Sophia's story was the most dramatic and the most closely guarded. In 1800, when she was 23, Sophia gave birth to a baby boy. The father was almost certainly Thomas Garth, one of her father's equerries, a military officer who had access to the princess that the court's security arrangements should have prevented. The pregnancy was concealed from the king. The birth happened in secret, possibly at a house away from the palace, and the baby was raised by a family on the estate. The secret was kept for years, though rumors circulated, and the stress of concealment contributed to the anxiety and depression that plagued Sophia for the rest of her life. Charlotte knew about Sophia's situation. She had to. A mother of 15 children does not fail to notice when one of her daughters is pregnant. The question is what she did about it, and the answer, as far as we can tell, is that she did what she always did. She managed. She helped conceal the pregnancy because the alternative, discovery by the king, would have been catastrophic. She protected her daughter the only way she could, by keeping the secret, by absorbing the scandal, by adding one more burden to the load she was already carrying. The nunnery persisted until the princesses were middle-aged. Some eventually married, late and without the joy that early marriages might have brought. Princess Mary married at 40. Princess Elizabeth married at 48. The others never married at all. They lived out their lives in the palace, growing older, growing quieter, growing invisible. Their youth consumed by a father's love that had become a father's tyranny. Charlotte gave birth 15 times in 21 years. The physical reality of 15 pregnancies in 21 years is something that modern women can barely imagine. Charlotte was pregnant for roughly 11 of those 21 years, her body never fully recovering from one birth before the next conception. The pregnancies were managed with the primitive obstetric care of the era, which meant that each delivery carried a genuine risk of death, and the fact that Charlotte survived all 15 without serious complication was a combination of good health, good luck, and a constitution that was built for endurance. The births happened at regular intervals, roughly every 18 months, a rhythm that was as relentless as the ticking of a clock. George Augustus in 1762, Frederick in 1763, William in 1765, Charlotte in 1766, Edward in 1767, Augusta in 1767, Elizabeth in 1770, Ernest in 1771, Augustus in 1773, Adolphus in 1774, Mary in 1776, Sophia in 1777, Octavius in 1779, Alfred in 1780, Amelia in 1783. 2 of the 15, Octavius and Alfred, died in childhood, and their deaths marked Charlotte and George deeply, particularly the death of Octavius at 4, whom George called his favorite son and whose loss sent the king into a grief that some historians believe contributed to the onset of his illness. Charlotte managed the nursery with the same efficiency she brought to the household. She hired the nurses, she selected the governesses. She supervised the children's education with an attention to detail that the court found admirable and the children found exasperating. She was not a permissive mother. She expected good behavior, good manners, and good performance in lessons. She was warm, but she was firm, and the firmness was the quality that her daughters inherited, and that her sons unfortunately did not. The emotional toll of constant childbearing is impossible to quantify. Charlotte loved her children. She also, if she was honest with herself, which she usually was, found the relentless cycle of pregnancy, birth, recovery, and renewed pregnancy exhausting. There is no record of her complaining about it, because queens did not complain about the duties their position required. But the toll was visible in her body and in her face, the youth draining from her features year by year, the weight of motherhood adding itself to the weight of queenship, and the weight of marriage duty, until the total was a burden that only a woman of extraordinary stamina could carry. Her body never fully recovering from one birth before the next conception. She was a devoted mother within the constraints of the era, involved in her children's education, concerned about their welfare, fighting with George over the daughter's right to marry. But she could not control her sons, who grew into the most scandalous collection of royal princes in British history, and she could not free her daughters, who remained trapped in what the princesses themselves called the nunnery. Marie Antoinette's 4 children were the center of her emotional life in a way that surprised everyone who knew her. The woman who had been dismissed as shallow and pleasure-seeking turned out to be a devoted, hands-on, deeply loving mother. She breastfed her first daughter, a decision that shocked the court, which expected the queen to hand the baby to a wet nurse immediately. She played with her children on the floor of her apartments, getting down on her hands and knees, building towers with blocks, making faces, doing the things that ordinary mothers do and that queens were not supposed to do. Her eldest daughter, Marie-Therese, called Mousseline by her family, was serious and intelligent and close to her mother in a way that intensified as the family's situation deteriorated. Her eldest son, Louis Joseph, was sickly from birth, suffering from a curvature of the spine that left him increasingly frail. He died in June 1789, just weeks before the storming of the Bastille, and Marie Antoinette's grief at his death was compounded by the revolution that followed almost immediately, the personal and the political disasters arriving simultaneously and leaving her no time to mourn one before the next overwhelmed her. Her second son, Louis Charles, was a bright, cheerful, physically healthy boy who became the center of Marie Antoinette's hopes after his older brother died. He was the Dauphin now, the heir to the throne, the boy who would one day be king. Marie Antoinette devoted herself to his education and his well-being with an intensity that reflected both her love for him and her understanding that his survival was the survival of the dynasty. When he was taken from her in July 1793, dragged from her arms by guards who carried him to a different floor of the temple, her screams were heard throughout the prison. The separation was the cruelest blow of the revolution, worse than the imprisonment, worse than the trial, worse than the sentence of death. They took her child. Everything else was secondary. Marie Antoinette had waited 7 agonizing years before her first child was born. The wait was public, humiliating, and corrosive. When her daughter Marie Therese finally arrived in 1778, Marie Antoinette was overjoyed and the country was relieved. 3 more children followed: a son Louis Joseph, who died of tuberculosis at 7, a son Louis Charles, who would die in prison at 10, and a daughter Sophie, who died as an infant. Marie Antoinette was a more attentive mother than either her reputation or her era would suggest. She nursed her children when court protocol said she should hand them to wet nurses. She played with them in the gardens of the Trianon. She worried about their education and their health with a tenderness that the caricaturists who mocked her as Madame Deficit never captured. The children were the one part of her life at Versailles that was not a performance. They were real. They were hers, and they would be taken from her, one by one, in the most brutal way imaginable. Catherine's experience of motherhood was the most painful and the most complicated. Her son Paul was born in 1754, and within minutes of the birth, Empress Elizabeth took the baby, literally took him, carried him out of the room and installed him in her own apartments, where he would be raised by nurses and tutors chosen by the Empress. Catherine was not consulted. She was not allowed to see her son except on rare supervised occasions. She lay in her bed after the delivery, alone, bleeding, listening to the sounds of celebration in the distant corridors, and the baby she had just delivered was somewhere in the palace being held by a woman who was not his mother. The separation shaped Catherine's relationship with Paul for the rest of both their lives. She did not bond with him as an infant because she was not allowed to. When she saw him as a child, the meetings were formal and awkward. 2 strangers performing the roles of mother and son, without the emotional foundation that the roles required. Paul grew up resentful, suspicious, and unstable, convinced that his mother did not love him, which was partly true and partly the inevitable consequence of a system that had prevented love from forming in the first place. Catherine's real investment was in her grandson Alexander. When Paul's wife gave birth to a son in 1777, Catherine took charge of the boy's education personally, choosing his tutors, designing his curriculum, shaping him into the enlightened ruler she wanted him to be. She seriously considered bypassing Paul entirely and naming Alexander as her heir. She did not do it ultimately, but the fact that she considered it tells you everything about the relationship between mother and son. Paul knew she had considered it. He never forgave her. The crises came for each of them, and the crises revealed who they really were. Charlotte's crisis was her husband's madness. In the autumn of 1788, George III began to behave strangely. He talked without stopping for hours, his voice hoarse, his words tumbling over each other in a stream that made less and less sense. He became agitated, aggressive, physically violent. He grabbed the Prince of Wales by the collar and threw him against a wall. He spoke to people who were not there. He addressed trees as though they were foreign ambassadors. Charlotte was terrified. The man she loved, the man she had built her life around, was disappearing in front of her eyes, replaced by a stranger who looked like her husband but who was not her husband, who did not recognize her, who frightened her in ways she had never been frightened before. The doctors excluded her from decisions about his treatment. They did not tell her what they were doing or why. She was the queen, and she was also in this crisis. Nobody. A woman whose opinions were not sought and whose presence was not required. She stayed anyway. When they moved George to Kew for treatment, Charlotte insisted on going with him. When they told her to stay at Windsor, she refused. "Where the king is, there I shall be," she said, and the words were not dramatic. They were factual. She was stating a principle that she had lived by for 27 years, and that she would live by for the rest of her life. Her duty was to her husband. Her place was beside him. The terror she felt, the very real fear that the man in the next room might harm her, did not change the calculus. She stayed. The treatments the doctors inflicted on George were barbaric by any standard and were probably worse than the disease itself. He was placed in a strait waistcoat, a garment that bound his arms to his body and prevented him from moving. He was strapped to a chair for hours. He was blistered, a procedure in which caustic substances were applied to the skin to raise painful welts that were supposed to draw out the illness. He was given emetics that made him vomit. He was given purgatives that emptied his bowels. He was bled, pints of blood drawn from his veins at a time when his body needed every drop. He was plunged into cold baths. He was lectured, scolded, and threatened by Dr. Francis Willis, the physician who was brought in to manage his case and who treated the king with a severity that bordered on cruelty. Charlotte was not allowed to see her husband during the worst of his episodes. The doctors decided that her presence was agitating to the king, and they excluded her without consulting her, without explaining their reasoning, without acknowledging that the woman who had shared his bed for 27 years might have something useful to contribute to his care. Charlotte accepted the exclusion because she had no choice, but the exclusion added a layer of helplessness to her already overwhelming fear. She could hear George shouting from the rooms where he was confined. She could hear the doctors' voices. She could not go to him. She could only wait, and listen, and pray. The staff at Kew later reported that Charlotte spent hours pacing the corridors near George's rooms, her hands clasped in front of her, her face composed but her eyes red from crying. She ate little during these episodes. She slept less. She aged visibly, the stress carving lines in her face and turning her hair from dark to grey to white in a process that seemed to accelerate with each episode. By the time George recovered from his first major episode in 1789, Charlotte looked a decade older than her actual age of 44. He had further episodes in 1801 and 1804, each one worse than the last, each one taking more from both of them. Charlotte's hair turned white. Her health deteriorated. The stress of living with a husband who might at any moment become someone else, who might be lucid at breakfast and raving by dinner, ground her down year by year, but she held on. She managed the household. She managed the family. She maintained the composure that her class demanded and that her character required. She endured. Marie Antoinette's crisis was the French Revolution, and the revolution was not a single event but a cascading series of disasters that accelerated over 4 years until they consumed everything the revolution had been building for years. France was bankrupt. The harvests had failed. Bread prices had doubled. The people were hungry, and the court was spending, and the gap between the two was a chasm that no amount of reform could bridge in time. Marie Antoinette was blamed for the spending, blamed with a venom that was partly deserved and partly the result of a propaganda campaign that had been running for years. Pamphlets depicted her as a monster of greed and depravity. Cartoons showed her bathing in gold while children starved. The name Madame Deficit, attached to her by the press, followed her like a shadow she could not escape. The Women's March on Versailles in October 1789 was the moment when the revolution became personal. 7,000 women, market women and working women and women who were simply hungry, marched from Paris to Versailles in the rain, carrying pikes and kitchen knives and pulling a cannon. They were led by women, but they were accompanied by men, and the crowd that arrived at the gates of Versailles in the early evening was not a polite delegation. It was an armed mob with a specific demand. Bring us the king. Bring us the queen. Bring us bread. The royal family barricaded themselves inside the palace. The National Guard, under the Marquis de Lafayette, arrived and attempted to maintain order. An uneasy truce was reached. The crowd camped in the courtyards. The royal family went to bed. And then, at dawn, a group of rioters found an unlocked gate and surged into the palace. They knew where they were going. They went directly to the Queen's apartments. They broke down the doors. Marie Antoinette's bodyguards fought them in the antechamber. 2 guards were killed. Their heads were cut off and placed on pikes, the first heads of the revolution, though they would not be the last. Marie Antoinette escaped through a hidden door and ran, barefoot, through the dark corridors to the king's apartments, her children gathered up by servants and brought to her. The family huddled together in the king's bedroom, while the mob raged through the corridors of the palace they had built, the palace that was supposed to represent the glory of France, and that now represented its fury. Lafayette persuaded the mob to accept a compromise. The royal family would come to Paris. They would live in the Tuileries Palace. They would be, in effect, hostages. The journey from Versailles to Paris took 6 hours, the royal carriage surrounded by the crowd, the heads of the murdered bodyguards carried on pikes alongside the carriage windows, close enough for the Queen to see the dead eyes of the men who had died trying to protect her. Marie Antoinette entered Paris with her children on her lap, and her face a mask of composure that cost her everything she had. The crowd jeered. They threw mud. They shouted insults that she pretended not to hear. The composure was her last weapon, the only thing she had left, and she deployed it with a discipline that her critics had never believed she possessed. She would deploy it again at her trial. She would deploy it on the scaffold. The woman who had been dismissed as frivolous and empty turned out, when everything was taken from her, to have a core of steel that the revolution could bend but could not break. The storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789 had been the beginning of the public revolution. Marie Antoinette understood its significance faster than her husband did. She urged Louis Fouquet to use the army to suppress the rebellion before it spread. Louis hesitated. He always hesitated. His kindness, which in a stable country would have been a virtue, was in a revolution a fatal weakness. He could not bring himself to order soldiers to fire on his own people, and his inability to act gave the revolution time to grow beyond anyone's ability to control it. In October 1789, a mob of Parisian women marched on Versailles. They were hungry. They were angry. They wanted bread, and they wanted the king and queen brought to Paris, where the people could watch them. The mob broke into the palace at dawn. They surged through the corridors toward the Queen's apartments. Marie Antoinette's guards were overwhelmed. 2 of them were killed, their heads placed on pikes. Marie Antoinette fled her bedroom in her nightgown, barefoot, running through the secret passages of the palace to find her children, her heart pounding, the sound of the mob behind her. The royal family was taken to Paris and installed in the Tuileries Palace, which was less a palace than a prison. They lived there under the watch of the National Guard, their movements monitored, their correspondence intercepted, their lives controlled by people who had been their subjects a year ago and who were now their jailers. Marie Antoinette's world, the world of Versailles and the Trianon, and the afternoon drives and the evening balls, was gone. It had been replaced by a world of fear and confinement, and the constant awareness that the mob could return at any moment. Louis was executed on January 21, 1793. Marie Antoinette heard the crowd roar. She was in her room at the Tuileries, or rather in the Temple, the medieval fortress where the royal family had been moved. She knew what the roar meant. Her husband was dead. She was alone. The months that followed were the worst of her life. Her son Louis Charles, 8 years old, was taken from her and placed with a cobbler named Antoine Simon, who was instructed to raise the boy as a citizen and to eradicate every trace of his royal upbringing. Simon abused the child. He gave him alcohol. He taught him to swear and to sing revolutionary songs. And then, in a moment of cruelty that defies comprehension, he coached the boy to make accusations against his own mother, Accusations so vile that they cannot be repeated here. Accusations that the revolutionaries used at Marie Antoinette's trial to justify her execution. Marie Antoinette's imprisonment lasted 10 months, from August 1792 to October 1793, and during those months she was methodically stripped of everything that defined her. Her title was taken. Her clothes were taken, the silks and satins of Versailles replaced by plain cotton. Her jewels were confiscated, her servants were dismissed. Her hair, which had been the canvas for Leonard's extravagant creations, turned white seemingly overnight, the pigment draining from it, as though the color itself was a luxury that the revolution would not permit. She was moved from the temple to the conciergerie, the medieval prison beside the Seine, in August 1793. Her cell was small, damp, and guarded by soldiers who watched her constantly, even when she changed her clothes, even when she used the chamber pot. The humiliation was deliberate. The revolution wanted to show that a queen was just a woman, that the body beneath the silk was the same as any other body, that the dignity she carried was a performance rather than an inherent quality. Marie Antoinette endured the humiliation with a composure that surprised everyone, including herself. She had spent 20 years being mocked for her frivolity, her spending, her supposed indifference to suffering. Now, in the worst suffering of her life, she discovered a strength that the frivolity had concealed. She was calm. She was dignified. She was, in the final months of her life, the queen that France had always wanted her to be. The queen she might have been if anyone had taught her how. She wrote letters. One of them, addressed to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, was her final testament, written in the early hours of October 16th, the morning of her execution. The letter is the most revealing document she ever produced. In it she forgave her enemies. She asked God's forgiveness for her own sins. She expressed her love for her children and her sorrow at leaving them. She was calm, clear, and unsentimental, writing with a precision that her childhood tutors, who had despaired of her handwriting and her spelling, would not have believed possible. The revolution had taken everything from her. It had also, in taking everything, revealed who she actually was. Marie Antoinette's trial was a formality. The verdict was predetermined. She was accused of treason, of conspiring with foreign powers, and of the accusations her son had been forced to make. When the charges involving her son were read aloud, she responded with the only words she is known to have spoken during the trial. She turned to the women in the public gallery and said, "I appeal to all mothers." The gallery was silent. Even the women who hated her could not deny the horror of what was being done. The night before her execution, Marie Antoinette was alone in her cell at the conciergerie. The cell was small, damp, and lit by a single candle. The walls were stone. The bed was a narrow cot with a straw mattress. The guards sat on the other side of a screen, close enough to hear every sound she made, close enough to watch her through the gaps in the screen if they chose to. She did not sleep. She sat at the small table in her cell and wrote the letter to Madame Elizabeth, her sister-in-law, the letter that would become her final testament. She wrote by candlelight, the pen scratching on the paper, the words coming slowly, because she was composing not just a letter but a farewell, not just to her family, and the composition required a care that she had rarely brought to anything she had written before. She wrote about her children. She asked Elizabeth to take care of them, to raise them with the values she had tried to instill, to tell them that their mother loved them. She did not know that her son was already being abused by his jailers. She did not know that her daughter was alone in a cell above her, separated by a few floors of stone, close enough to touch if the walls had not been there. She wrote as though her children might receive the letter, as though her words might reach them, as though the love she poured into the sentences could cross the barriers that the revolution had placed between them. She wrote about forgiveness. She forgave her enemies, which was expected. She asked for God's forgiveness for her own sins, which was conventional. But she also forgave herself, or tried to, for the failures and the mistakes that had brought her to this cell, the spending and the carelessness and the failure to understand, until it was too late, the world she lived in. The forgiveness was hard. It is always hard to forgive yourself when you are sitting in a cell waiting to die. In the morning the executioner came to cut her hair. She sat still while he sheared it close to her head, the grey-white strands falling to the stone floor. She had once had the most famous hair in Europe, dressed by Leonard in towers of powder and feathers that reached 3 feet above her head. Now her hair was a few inches long, cropped for the blade, and the woman who sat in the chair was unrecognizable as the girl who had arrived at Versailles at 14, pretty and silly and completely unprepared for what the world would do to her. Her hands were tied behind her back. She was placed in an open cart, not the closed carriage that had been used for Louis, because the revolution wanted the people to see her, to see the fallen queen humiliated and helpless, to see the proof that the old world was dead. Cécile cart traveled slowly through the streets of Paris, and the crowds that lined the route were dense and hostile and loud. She sat upright. She did not look at the crowd. She looked straight ahead, at a point somewhere beyond the buildings and the sky, a point that no one else could see, and the composure she maintained was the last performance of a woman who had spent her life performing and who was determined to perform this final scene with the dignity that her life had so often lacked. The guillotine stood in the Place de la Révolution, which had been the Place de Louis-Philippe, which is now the Place de la Concorde. It was a simple machine, a wooden frame, a heavy blade, a basket to catch the head. Marie Antoinette climbed the scaffold. She stumbled. She stepped on the executioner's foot. She apologized. The apology was instinctive, the reflex of a woman who had been raised to be polite, and the politeness, in that context, at that moment, on that scaffold, was the most heartbreaking thing she ever said. The blade fell. The head was shown to the crowd. The crowd cheered. The body was taken to the Madeleine cemetery and buried in an unmarked grave. She was 37 years old. She had been Queen of France for 23 years. She had been a prisoner for 4. She had been alive for 37 years, and she had been happy, truly happy, for perhaps 5 of them, the years at the Trianon with her children, the years before the revolution. She rode to the guillotine in an open cart, her hair shorn, her hands tied behind her back, wearing a plain white dress. She was thin, white-haired, and barely recognizable as the beautiful girl who had arrived at Versailles at 14. She climbed the scaffold with composure. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last words were an apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." The shockwave of Marie Antoinette's execution traveled across Europe at the speed of a courier's horse and hit every palace with the force of an earthquake. In Vienna, Maria Theresa's successors received the news with a horror that was both personal and political. Marie Antoinette was a Habsburg. She was family. The execution of a Habsburg princess by a French mob was an insult to every crowned head in Europe and a threat to every throne on the continent. In Russia, Catherine received the news and immediately expelled the French ambassador. She broke off diplomatic relations with the revolutionary government. She ordered mourning at the Russian court. Her response was partly political, a statement of solidarity with the monarchist cause, but it was also personal. Catherine understood better than most that a queen's power rested on the consent of the governed, and that consent could be withdrawn. She had seized her own throne by force, which meant she knew how fragile thrones were. Marie Antoinette's fate was a reminder that Catherine herself was only as secure as the army that had put her there. In the great houses of England, the reaction was fear. The English aristocracy had always maintained a comfortable sense of superiority over the French, believing that English liberty and English institutions made revolution impossible in Britain. Marie Antoinette's execution challenged that assumption. The English poor were hungry too. The English workers were angry too. The gap between rich and poor in England was as wide as it was in France. If the French could overthrow their monarchy, why not the English? The fear produced a reaction that shaped British politics for a generation. The government cracked down on radical organizations. Public meetings were restricted. The press was monitored. Habeas corpus was suspended. The ruling class closed ranks with a solidarity born of terror, and the terror persisted long after the immediate threat had passed. The modesty that characterized the English court, which George III had practiced out of personal preference, now became a deliberate strategy for survival. Display was dangerous. Extravagance was dangerous. Any behavior that reminded the public of Marie Antoinette was behavior that could get you killed. Charlotte absorbed this lesson more deeply than anyone. She had spent her marriage being modest and dutiful because that was her nature. Now she understood that her nature had saved her. The restraint she had practiced for decades was not just a personal choice. It was the quality that separated a surviving queen from a dead one. She looked at Marie Antoinette's fate and she saw, with perfect clarity, what could happen to a queen who lost the public's trust. She never forgot the lesson. Neither did Victoria, who inherited it through Leopold and through the institutional memory of a monarchy that had learned, from Marie Antoinette's blood, the price of indifference. The news of Marie Antoinette's execution had reached England within days, and it detonated like a bomb in every palace and every great house on the continent. Charlotte wept. She wept for the woman she had never met but whose fate she understood instinctively, because Charlotte knew that what had happened in France could happen anywhere. If the French could execute their queen, any queen could be executed. If the French could tear down their monarchy, any monarchy could be torn down. The lesson was clear and it was terrifying. The contract between the crown and the people was not permanent. The people could break it. And when they broke it, the consequences were absolute. The English aristocracy absorbed this lesson with a fear that shaped their behavior for generations. The modesty of the English court, which George III had practiced out of personal preference, now became a survival strategy. The extravagance that Marie Antoinette had embodied was not just vulgar, it was dangerous. A queen who spent too much, who partied too visibly, who seemed indifferent to the suffering of the poor, was a queen who was inviting her own destruction. Charlotte understood this. She had always been modest. Now she was modest with purpose, knowing that the restraint was not just a personal choice but a political necessity. Catherine's crisis was different from Charlotte's and Marie Antoinette's because Catherine created it herself. In 1762, her husband Peter had been emperor for 6 months and had managed in that time to alienate virtually every powerful institution in Russia. He had withdrawn from the 7 Years' War on terms favorable to Prussia. He had insulted the Russian Orthodox Church. He had antagonized the military. Alvalembo humiliated Catherine by flaunting his mistress and by announcing, at a state dinner, that he intended to divorce Catherine and marry Elizabeth Vorontsova. Catherine's preparations for the coup had been months in the making. She had cultivated allies in every important institution. The Orlov brothers, Grigory and his 4 siblings, commanded the loyalty of the Guards regiments that controlled Saint Petersburg. Princess Dashkova, one of the most brilliant women at court, provided social connections and political intelligence. The Senate, the Church, and the diplomatic corps had all been quietly sounded out and found willing to support a change of regime. The morning of the coup, Catherine was at the palace of Peterhof, 20 miles from St. Petersburg. Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother, arrived at dawn and told her that the plan had been discovered, that a conspirator had been arrested, and that they had to move immediately or the opportunity would be lost. Catherine did not hesitate. She dressed in a plain black dress, left the palace without waking Peter, and rode to St. Petersburg in a carriage driven at breakneck speed along the coast road. She arrived at the barracks of the Izmailovsky Guards at 7 in the morning. The soldiers were assembled. Catherine stepped out of the carriage, still in her plain black dress, her hair loose, her face pale from the ride, and she addressed them. She did not shout. She did not make a speech. She simply told them who she was and what she intended to do, and she asked them to follow her. They followed. The acclamation was immediate, enthusiastic, and loud enough to be heard across the city. She moved from regiment to regiment, gathering support, the column of soldiers behind her growing with each stop. By noon, she had 14,000 men under her command. She went to the Kazan Cathedral, where the archbishop was waiting, and she was proclaimed Empress of all the Russias. She then changed into a guards officer's uniform, green coat with gold facings, white breeches, black boots, and she mounted a white horse and rode at the head of her army toward Peterhof to confront Peter. The image of Catherine on the white horse has become one of the iconic images of the 18th century, and deservedly so. A woman in a man's uniform leading an army, overthrowing her own husband, seizing the throne of the largest country on earth. It was not just audacious, it was unprecedented. No woman in European history had ever done anything like it. Queens had inherited thrones. Queens had served as regents. Queens had wielded power behind the scenes. But no queen had ever taken a throne by force, in broad daylight, at the head of an army. With her own husband as the enemy, Peter surrendered without resistance. Sinceros. It was pathetic at the end, weeping, begging Catherine to share the throne with him, offering to abdicate in exchange for his freedom. Catherine rejected every offer. Peter was taken to a country estate and placed under guard. 8 days later, he was dead. Catherine decided that if she waited for Peter to destroy her, he would, so she destroyed him first. On the morning of June 28, 1762, Catherine left the palace at Peterhof, where she had been staying with Peter, and rode to Saint Petersburg to meet the Orlov brothers, the guards officers, who had been organizing the coup on her behalf. She arrived at the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment, still in her nightgown, and addressed the soldiers. They acclaimed her as empress. Other regiments followed. By midday, Catherine had the support of the entire St. Petersburg garrison. She changed into a borrowed guards officer's uniform, mounted a white horse, and rode at the head of the troops to confront Peter. The image is extraordinary. A woman in a man's uniform, on a white horse, leading an army to overthrow her own husband. It was the most audacious act of political courage in the 18th century, and Catherine performed it with a calm that suggested she had been rehearsing it in her mind for years. She probably had. Peter surrendered without a fight. He was arrested, taken to a house in the countryside, and placed under guard. 8 days later he was dead, officially of a hemorrhoidal colic, almost certainly murdered by the Orlov brothers, probably with Catherine's knowledge, and possibly on her orders. The question of Catherine's complicity in Peter's death has never been definitively answered. She never addressed it publicly. She never needed to. She was the empress. Empresses do not explain. Catherine ruled Russia for 34 years. She expanded the empire south and west, annexing Crimea, partitioning Poland, adding territories that doubled Russia's size. She modernized the law, reformed local government, established schools and hospitals, and governed with a hands-on attention to detail that exhausted her ministers. She corresponded with the greatest minds in Europe. Voltaire called her the Star of the North. Diderot visited her court and spent hours in conversation with her, marveling at an empress who could discuss philosophy with the sophistication of a Parisian intellectual and then, in the same afternoon, order the annexation of a province. She took lovers throughout her reign, dozens of them, over the decades. Young officers chosen for their looks and their vigor, installed in apartments near her own, showered with titles and estates, and then replaced when she tired of them. The practice was open, acknowledged, and accepted by the court with a shrug. Catherine was the empress. She could do as she pleased. The lovers served a function, providing companionship and physical comfort, and Catherine treated them with a generosity that was partly affection and partly compensation. Her final lover, Platon Zubov, was 38 years younger than her. The relationship was the subject of gossip across Europe, and the gossip was not kind. An elderly empress with a young officer was, to the courts of Europe, a figure of ridicule. Catherine did not care. She had spent her entire adult life not caring what other people thought, and the habit was too deeply ingrained to break in her 60s. Catherine's daily routine as empress was punishing. She rose at 5 every morning, lit her own fire because she did not want to wake the servants, and spent the first 2 hours of the day reading, writing, and planning. She drank black coffee, very strong, sometimes 5 or 6 cups before breakfast. She worked with her ministers from 8 until noon, reviewing reports, signing decrees, dictating correspondence. She ate a simple lunch, usually alone. She walked in the palace gardens in the afternoon, regardless of the weather, accompanied by her greyhounds and by whatever minister had business to discuss. She received visitors in the evening, hosted concerts and theatrical performances, and retired early. The discipline was extraordinary. She never took a day off. She never complained about the workload. She governed Russia the way a general commands an army, with a combination of strategic vision and attention to detail that left her subordinates exhausted and slightly frightened. A minister who brought her a report with an error in it would find the error circled in red ink with a note in Catherine's handwriting explaining what was wrong and how to fix it. She missed nothing. She forgot nothing. She expected the same from everyone around her, and the expectation was terrifying. Her wit was legendary. She collected jokes the way she collected paintings, storing them in her memory and deploying them with devastating timing. Her correspondence with Voltaire is full of humor that is sharp, literate, and surprisingly modern. She mocked pretension. She punctured pomposity. She made fun of herself, which was the most disarming thing an empress could do, because self-deprecation from the most powerful woman in Europe was a form of charm that no one could resist. She had a particular weakness for dogs. She kept greyhounds and Italian greyhounds, small, elegant dogs that followed her everywhere, sleeping on her bed, sitting at her feet during audiences, accompanying her on walks. The dogs were her constant companions, more reliable than lovers, less demanding than ministers, and the warmth she showed them was the warmth of a woman who had learned, through decades of political maneuvering, to reserve her unguarded affection for creatures who could not betray her. The lovers were selected with the same care that she brought to everything else. She did not choose carelessly. Each man was evaluated, sometimes tested by her current favorite, before being admitted to the inner circle, assessed for his temperament, his discretion, his ability to provide the companionship that Catherine needed, without the political complications that a careless choice could create. The successful candidates were installed in apartments connected to hers by a private passage, given titles and estates, and treated with a generosity that was both personal and political. When a relationship ended, it ended with gifts rather than recriminations. The ex-favorites kept their titles and their estates and their silence, and the system continued, smooth and efficient, for 34 years. The relationship between Catherine and Paul was one of the most tortured parent-child relationships in European history. It was poisoned from the beginning by Elizabeth's decision to take the baby, a decision that Catherine could not reverse because she was not the empress, and because the empress' word was law. The poison spread over the decades, fed by mutual resentment, mutual suspicion, and the fundamental incompatibility of their temperaments. Paul grew up to be everything Catherine was not. Where she was rational, he was emotional. Where she was strategic, he was impulsive. Where she was charming, he was abrasive. He inherited his father's instability without inheriting his mother's intelligence, a genetic combination that made him difficult as a child and dangerous as an adult. He knew that his mother despised him, or at least he believed she did, and the belief became a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the resentment he carried made him behave in ways that confirmed Catherine's worst opinions of him. Catherine's relationship with her grandson Alexander was the mirror image of her relationship with Paul. She took Alexander from his parents the way Elizabeth had taken Paul from her, repeating the pattern with a lack of self-awareness that is striking in a woman who is otherwise so perceptive. She hired tutors who shared her Enlightenment values. She designed a curriculum that emphasized reason, science, and liberal governance. She raised Alexander to be the ruler she wanted Paul to be, and the boy responded with an intelligence and a charm that reminded Catherine of herself at the same age. The tension between Catherine and Paul cast a shadow over the last years of her reign. Paul lived at his own estate, Gacina, maintaining a miniature court that mirrored his mother's in Saint Petersburg, but that operated on different principles. Where Catherine's court was liberal and cosmopolitan, Paul's was rigid and militaristic. Where Catherine valued discussion and debate, Paul valued discipline and obedience. The two courts existed in parallel, and the existence of Paul's alternative court was a silent reproach to Catherine that she felt keenly and never acknowledged publicly. Catherine died before she could resolve the succession question. She had drawn up documents naming Alexander as her heir, but the documents were never formally published, and after her death, Paul's supporters destroyed them. Paul became emperor. His reign lasted 5 years and ended with his assassination, murdered in his own bedroom by officers who could no longer tolerate his paranoid and erratic rule. The killing was brutal. He was strangled with a scarf. The officers responsible were never punished. Alexander, who almost certainly knew about the plot, became emperor at the age of 23 and spent the rest of his life haunted by the knowledge that his reign was built on his father's murder, which was itself built on his grandmother's usurpation, which was built on his grandfather's murder. The violence cascaded down through the generations, each act of violence begetting the next, Catherine's original sin reproducing itself in forms she could not have predicted and would not have approved. Catherine in her final years was a woman who had outlived most of her contemporaries, and who carried the knowledge with a pragmatism that concealed an occasional melancholy. She was 67 when she died, old by the standards of the 18th century, and her body had begun to betray her in ways that her mind refused to accept. Her legs swelled, her breathing was labored. She needed help getting out of chairs. But she continued to work, continued to govern, continued to read and write and argue with her ministers, because stopping was a form of dying and she was not ready to die. She spent her final evenings in her private apartments, surrounded by her dogs and her books and the art she had collected over 3 decades. She played cards with a few trusted friends. She drank coffee. She talked about philosophy and politics and the gossip of the European courts with a sharpness that age had not blunted. She was, in these quiet evening hours, the most human version of herself, the version that the public never saw, the woman behind the empress, the girl from Anhalt-Zerbst who had traveled so far and climbed so high and who sat now in a warm room in a cold city, watching the fire and remembering. Marie Antoinette never grew old. She never became a grandmother. She never sat by a fire in her later years and remembered the girl she had been. She was 37 when she died, which is young by any standard, and the life she might have lived, the decades of maturity and wisdom and the mellowing that age brings, were taken from her as completely as her crown and her children and her freedom. The revolution did not just kill her. It erased the future she should have had, the woman she might have become, the grandmother who might have told her grandchildren about Versailles and the Trianon and the dog she cried for at the border. That woman never existed. She was murdered before she could be born. She died on November 17, 1796, at the age of 67, still on the throne, still in power, still formidable. She had been empress for 34 years. She had transformed Russia from a backward, isolated, semi-medieval state into a European great power. She had never gone home to Germany. She had never looked back. She had become Russia, more Russian than the Russians, and the country she had adopted had rewarded her with the title she had earned, Catherine the Great, the only woman in European history to bear that title. Her son Paul, whom she had considered bypassing for the succession, became emperor after her death. He ruled for 5 years before being assassinated by his own officers in 1801, murdered in the same way his father had been murdered, strangled in his bedroom by men who served him. Her grandson Alexander, the boy she had raised and educated and shaped, became emperor after Paul's death and ruled for 24 years. He defeated Napoleon. He reshaped Europe at the Congress of Vienna. He was in many ways the ruler Catherine had designed him to be, the product of her intelligence and her ambition and her refusal to leave the future. Charlotte's endurance had a quality that is easy to overlook because it was not dramatic. She did not ride a white horse. She did not face a guillotine. She did not seize a throne. She simply held on year after year, decade after decade, through madness and scandal and grief, through the slow degradation of a family she had built and a monarchy she had served, through the deaths of grandchildren and the disgrace of sons and the imprisonment of daughters. She held on because that was her nature and because letting go was not an option she could consider. The hold had consequences. Because Charlotte held the family together, the monarchy survived the Georgian era. Because the monarchy survived, the institution was there for Victoria to inherit. Because Victoria inherited a functioning monarchy, she was able to reform it, modernize it, and transform it into the symbol of stability and duty that it became under her reign. The straight line from Charlotte's endurance to Victoria's triumph is invisible but unbreakable. Without the grandmother, the granddaughter would have had nothing to inherit. Victoria never knew Charlotte. She was born 6 months after Charlotte died, but she inherited Charlotte's legacy in ways that went beyond the crown. She inherited Charlotte's sense of duty, transmitted through Leopold, Charlotte's granddaughter's widower, who mentored Victoria and shaped her character. She inherited Charlotte's preference for domesticity, for a modest court, for a family life that was genuine rather than performed. She inherited, most importantly, Charlotte's understanding that the monarchy survived not through extravagance, but through service, not through display but through duty, not through grandeur, but through the quiet, unglamorous, daily work of holding things together. The monarchy that Victoria left behind when she died in 1901 was the most admired institution in Europe. Her children sat on thrones across the continent. Her name defined an era. Her values, domestic virtue, public service, personal restraint, became the values of the British monarchy itself, embedded so deeply that they persist to this day. These were Charlotte's values, filtered through a century of change, refined by Victoria's intelligence and codified by Albert's discipline, but Charlotte's at their root. The quiet queen from Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who took snuff and grew flowers and endured her husband's madness without complaint, had planted seeds that she never saw bloom. Charlotte died in 1818 in a black armchair at Kew Palace, holding her daughter's hands. She had endured her husband's madness, her son's disgrace, her daughter's imprisonment, and her granddaughter Princess Charlotte's death. She had held the family together for 57 years. She died not knowing whether the succession would survive. 6 months later, a baby named Victoria was born. Victoria would reign for 63 years, repair the damage the Georgian princes had done, and become the most famous queen since Elizabeth I. Charlotte's endurance had made Victoria possible, though Charlotte never knew it. Marie Antoinette's legacy was written in blood, and the blood was not only hers. Her eldest daughter, Marie Therese, survived the revolution. She was imprisoned in the temple for 3 years, separated from her mother, her father, her aunt, and her brother. She spent months in solitary confinement, a teenage girl alone in a stone cell, not knowing whether her family was alive or dead, not knowing whether she would be executed too. She was released in 1795 in a prisoner exchange and sent to Austria, her mother's homeland, a country she had never visited, and that she reached as an orphan, a refugee, and a traumatized young woman who would spend the rest of her life trying to make sense of what had happened to her family. Marie Therese married her cousin, the Duke of Angoulême, and lived until 1851. She was a quiet, religious woman who carried her grief privately and who never fully recovered from the revolution. She returned to France during the Bourbon Restoration and briefly held the title of Queen of France, though only for 20 minutes during the confused hours of the July Revolution of 1830. when her father-in-law Charles X abdicated in favor of her husband, who immediately abdicated in himself. 20 minutes as queen. It was the saddest crown in European history. Her son Louis Charles the Dauphin, the boy who should have been Louis XVII, was taken from Marie Antoinette in July 1793 and given to Antoine Simon, a cobbler who had been appointed his guardian by the revolutionary government. Simon's task was to transform a prince into a citizen, to erase every trace of royalty from the child's character and behavior. He did this through cruelty. He gave the boy alcohol. He taught him to swear. He beat him. He paraded him through the streets in a revolutionary cap. He made a 10-year-old boy into a propaganda tool. And then, when the propaganda value was exhausted, he abandoned him. Louis Charles was moved to a cell in the temple and left alone. He was 10 years old. He had no company, no education, no medical care, no comfort of any kind. He developed tuberculosis. His body, weakened by malnutrition and neglect, could not fight the disease. He died on June 8, 1795 at the age of 10, alone in a cell in a prison, the last male heir of the Bourbon dynasty, a child whose only crime was his birth. The horror of Louis Charles' fate shocked even people who had supported the revolution. A child. A 10-year-old child, left to die alone in a cell. The revolution had executed a king and a queen. It had imprisoned a princess. It had tortured and killed a child. The legacy of Marie Antoinette was not just her own death. It was the destruction of an entire family, the systematic elimination of a bloodline that had ruled France for centuries, carried out with a cruelty that history has never fully absorbed. Her execution was the defining image of the French Revolution, the moment when the old world died and the new world was born in violence. Her son Louis Charles died in prison in 1795 at the age of 10, alone, sick and neglected. Her daughter Marie-Therese survived the revolution and was eventually released, the only member of the immediate family to escape alive. She lived until 1851, a quiet, sad woman who never recovered from what she had witnessed as a child, who never forgot the sound of the mob in the corridors of Versailles or the day they took her brother from her mother's arms. But Marie Antoinette's death did something that her life had not. It changed the behavior of every monarchy in Europe. The lesson of her execution was absorbed by every royal family on the continent. Extravagance was dangerous. Distance from the people was dangerous. The assumption that the crown was permanent and the people were powerless was not just wrong. It was fatal. Charlotte's England became more modest because of what happened to Marie Antoinette's France. Victoria's court became more moral, more visible, more connected to the public, because the alternative, the Versailles model of isolation and excess, had led to the guillotine. The lesson traveled forward through time. When Victoria became queen in 1837, 44 years after Marie Antoinette's execution, the lesson was still alive in the institutional memory of the British monarchy. Victoria's advisors, her prime ministers, and her own instincts all pointed in the same direction. Be visible, be modest, be connected to the people. Do not build a Versailles. Do not play shepherdess while the country starves. Do not assume that the crown is permanent and the people are powerless. Victoria followed the lesson with a discipline that was partly conscious and partly inherited. Her court was modest. Her personal spending was restrained. She visited hospitals and schools and factories. She allowed herself to be seen, to be approached, to be human in a way that Marie Antoinette, trapped behind the golden gates of Versailles, had never been permitted to be. The result was a monarchy that the people trusted, that the people defended, that the people carried forward into the 20th century and beyond. Marie Antoinette would not have recognized Victoria's court. The simplicity, the sobriety, the earnest dedication to duty would have baffled a woman who had been raised at Versailles and who had never eaten a meal that was not served on gold plate. But Marie Antoinette's death was the reason Victoria's court existed in the form it did. The execution at the Place de la Révolution on October 16, 1793, was the founding event of modern constitutional monarchy, The moment when every surviving royal family in Europe understood that their survival depended not on their divine right, but on their ability to earn and maintain the trust of the people they served. Marie Antoinette's death saved other monarchies by teaching them what not to do. Her tragedy became their instruction manual. The queen, who was mocked for her spending and her parties and her indifference to suffering, became, in death, the most powerful argument for restraint and duty and public service that the royal houses of Europe had ever received. She taught them by dying. It was the most expensive lesson in history. History has judged them differently. Charlotte is the least known of the three, remembered primarily as Queen Charlotte from Bridgerton, a woman whose real life was more interesting and more admirable than any dramatization has captured. She was not glamorous. She was not dramatic. She was steady, dutiful, and enduring, qualities that do not make for exciting television, but that are, in the long run, the qualities that keep institutions alive and families together. Marie Antoinette is the most famous, remembered for her execution, and for the phrase she almost certainly never said, "Let them eat cake." The phrase was attributed to her by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in a book published when Marie Antoinette was 9 years old, which means it was not her phrase, and was not about her, but it has clung to her name for 2 centuries because it captures something that the public believed about her, whether or not it was true. She has become a symbol, and symbols are not people. The real woman, the warm, funny, generous, foolish, loving, tragic woman who cried for her dog and screamed when they took her son, has been lost behind the myth. Catherine is remembered as the great, the only woman in European history to earn that title. The title is deserved. She transformed Russia. She expanded the empire. She modernized the government. She corresponded with the finest minds in Europe and held her own in every conversation. She was also ruthless, autocratic, and complicit in the murder of her own husband, qualities that history has been willing to forgive in a man, but that it has never entirely forgiven in a woman. The double standard is as old as the monarchy itself. A king who seizes a throne by force is called a conqueror. A queen who does the same is called a usurper. Catherine was both, and neither label captures the full complexity of a woman who refused to accept the life she was given and who built, from nothing, the life she wanted. 3 German girls, 3 foreign thrones, 3 fates. Charlotte held on. She endured a husband's madness, a family's disgrace, a nation's contempt for her sons. She held on through 57 years of marriage, through 15 childbirths, through the slow, grinding destruction of everything she had built. She held on because holding on was what she did, because her character was built for endurance the way a bridge is built for weight, and the weight never broke her, though it bent her, though it bent her back, though it turned her hair white and wore her body down, and left her, at the end, sitting in a black armchair at Kew with nothing left to hold except her daughter's hands. Marie Antoinette was consumed. She was a girl who was sent to a country she did not understand, married to a man she could not reach, placed in a court she could not navigate, and blamed for failures that were not entirely hers. She was not blameless. She spent too much. She understood too little. She failed to read the mood of a country that was starving while she played shepherdess. But the punishment was grotesque, out of all proportion to the crime, and the cruelty of her end, the shaved head, the bound hands, the cart to the scaffold, the blade, is a cruelty that history has never fully reckoned with. Catherine conquered. She refused the role she was given. She refused to be quiet. She refused to be decorative. She refused to accept a husband she despised and a life she had not chosen. She took the throne by force and she held it by intelligence, and she used it to transform a country. She was not kind. She was not gentle. She was not the sort of woman you would want to cross. But she was extraordinary, and the Russia she left behind was a Russia that bore her mark as surely as if she had carved her name in the walls of the Winter Palace. The same world made all 3 of them. The same system trained them, the system of arranged marriages and foreign brides, and the expectation that a queen's job was to produce heirs and keep quiet. Charlotte accepted the system and survived within it. Marie Antoinette accepted the system and was destroyed by it. Catherine rejected the system and remade it in her own image. The question their stories ask is the question every woman in every era has faced. When the world hands you a role you did not choose, in a place you did not pick, beside a person you did not select, what do you do? Do you endure? Do you break? Or do you fight? Charlotte endured. Marie Antoinette broke. Catherine fought. Each answer had a cost. Each answer had a consequence. And each answer tells us something about what women are capable of when the system that was supposed to protect them fails, as systems always do eventually for everyone. If you enjoyed this journey through the lives of three queens, I would love it if you would subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from. There are more stories to tell, more queens to meet, more fates to follow. And if you know someone who loves Bridgerton, or Queen Charlotte, or the history of the women who shaped Europe, please share this with them. Rest well tonight. The palaces are quiet now. The candles are out. The thrones are empty. But the stories of the women who sat in them are still alive, still resonating, still asking the question that has no final answer. What would you have done? Good night.